brilliant you all arrived at once, because we were only 3 of us at one point, so it's fantastic. We've got loads going on at the RNCM, and it's brilliant to have that vibrancy back again. We've all missed that. George Lewis on one side and Peter Hill. But we're here to welcome Peter Hill, who is a fellow of the RNCM and also an honorary research professor with us. We're delighted and proud that he has this connection with the RNCM. I am particularly because he has he's one of the people in French music that we have so much respect for. Peter is an expert, he's a pianist, a professional pianist and a musicologist, and he combines those in a really important way, and a sort of an important example of how these two areas can come together with such skill. He has numerous publications on Messiaen and recordings, of course, and he also has a publication of The Rite of Spring as well, which many of you will also know. His career has spanned a number of generations now, and each time he brings new insights into particularly the composer of Messiaen. And we're delighted because today he's going to be talking about Messiaen, and he's given us a wonderful handout. So without more ado, I would like to welcome Peter Hill.
Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be here. Now, my title, How Messiaen Composed, quite a bold one, I suppose, to try and define how a composer composed. I could give that a subtitle, How to Compose Oneself Out of a Midlife Crisis. And you can see that if you look at page 1 of your handout. You'll see in the top right corner I put a number to help you, so hopefully you'll find the right place pretty easily. I'm going to concentrate on what for me is one of the most fascinating periods in Messiaen's life, from the late 1940s to the late 1950s, partly selfishly I must admit because it contains some of Messiaen's greatest piano music, but it's particularly interesting, I think, because we see Messiaen actually remaking his whole musical language during that time. If you look at this list of works, I've started with Vision de l'Armène, but I could have started one before that with the Quartet for the End of Time, which of course Messiaen composed in a prisoner of war camp over the winter of 1940 to 41. He was repatriated early in 1941, and by May that year he was teaching harmony, actually, not composition, harmony at the Paris Conservatoire, and in his class he discovered he had a brilliant 17-year-old pianist, as she was then, Yvonne Laurier, and he was completely dazzled by her and by her piano playing, and at once set about to write works that included her, first of divisions of the Armène for 2 pianos. Messiaen played one of the pianos, Laurier the other. The Petite Liturgie with an important solo piano part. The epic Vingt Regards, well, this is music on the most colossal scale. I mean, I should say Vision, of course, tracks us from just the beginnings of creation, right back at the beginning of Genesis, if you like, to the point at which the ultimate union of creation with its creator. Well, that's done in about 50 minutes. Vingt Regards, a huge scale. I've heard performances which have lasted 2.5 hours. Harawi, the longest and perhaps greatest of his 3 song cycles, and then the Turangalîla Symphony, a symphony composed not in 4 movements but in 10. And Messiaen, early in 1948, gave a press interview, and he was asked what he was going to compose next, and he said, I am planning an opera. I won't tell you what the subject is, but I'm planning to write an opera. So he was obviously going to go on in the same vein, on the same scale. But in fact, it was to be almost 30 years before he began work on his one opera, on the life of St. Francis, Saint François d'Assise. And instead, he completely changed course. Saint Christian, which he composed while he was, just after he'd finished the orchestration of Turangalîla, is a one-off, really, with Messiaen, this work, extraordinary work for 12 solo voices. And it's very much in the wake of Turangalîla. It contains a lot of motifs and themes from Turangalîla, and is also part of the same family of works, the so-called Tristan trilogy. It was a term that Messiaen himself used, that link Harawi, Turangalîla, and Saint Christian. But after that, it's all change. The next 4 works, they're all for solo instruments, and indeed the 2 instruments that Messiaen himself played, the piano and the organ, and they become the vehicle for, shall we say, experiment. Anyway, these 3 years are often referred to by Messiaen's biographers as his experimental phase. The difficulties one has with a lecture title of this type is that Messiaen himself was extremely secretive about his composing. There's a paradox here, because Messiaen perhaps produced more written and spoken words about his own music than any composer in the history of music, with the possible exception of Stockhausen. There's an enormous amount out there. The printed stuff, there's the early Technique of Musical Language, a sort of primer on his music, which was published when he was only 34 years old, and then the posthumous treatise, which runs to 8 great fat volumes, I'm sure it's in your library, which is a sort of compilation of all his notes on many, many subjects, but centering always on his own music, made over a lifetime. In fact, throughout his life, he was actually obsessed with this treatise. It keeps popping up in marginal notes in his diaries and so on. So despite all that, he was actually very secretive about his actual composing. You'll find in the published works that it lays out the materials that he's using and perhaps what he's aiming at, but it doesn't actually tell you what's actually going on, creative decisions that were taken. So that the door of his composing studio is kept firmly shut. Now, I discovered this for the first time when I first went to Messiaen and worked with him for the first time. I was working then on the Catalogue and went over at his invitation to play it to him and receive his advice. And we had paused for a cup of tea mid-session, and just by way of making conversation, I said to Messiaen, tell me, Maître, what are you working on at the moment? Well, the atmosphere up to that point had been extremely cordial. In fact, he was one of the most courteous human beings I've ever met, but all of a sudden a frost descended, and I realised that I'd said completely the wrong thing. So this was to be absolutely secret. To give you an example of just how secret, when Messiaen started to write the opera on St. Francis, he started in about 1975, and only 2 people in the world knew that this was going on. There was Messiaen himself and Rolf Liebermann, who was the director of the Paris Opera. And nothing was said to Messiaen's wife, who was Yvonne Laurier, of course. And she told me that she observed in the apartment these large cardboard boxes filling up with manuscript paper. So she knew that something was afoot, but she wasn't allowed to know. It was only when Liebermann let the cat out of the bag during a radio interview that Messiaen could no longer keep this a secret, whereupon he promptly co-opted his wife in order to make a vocal score of the opera as he went along, so she could make herself useful. But so this is absolutely fantastic. He was totally, totally secret. Now, the other problem we have is that there are no sketches surviving from the early music. Earlier music of Messiaen. Before about 1964, we have no sketches, and the reason we have them after 1964 is that Laurier appointed herself as a kind of archivist of Messiaen's work and started to keep them. Why are there none before that? Well, they may have simply been lost or in some way abandoned or considered unimportant or something, but my bet is that they were actually deliberately destroyed by Messiaen because of this passion for secrecy. However, one sketch and one sketch only survived, and it's here on your page 2. This is a page from Messiaen Perspectives 1, which you can follow this up in your library, and it's a chapter in that book by Yves Baldner. And the discovery that when Messiaen in 1950 presented to the National Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, a manuscript copy of the Vision de l'Amen, it was found that probably by accident he'd wrapped it up with a sheet of manuscript paper which contained sketches for the first movement. And these are the sketches that you see before you here. So you can see, here we are, the movement is called the Amen of the Creation. And we start with this FFF, theme, probably played in unison. It's rather like the sixth movement of the Quartet at the end of time, the Danse de la Fureur. And this was to be interleaved with the music below that, which is theme A. I'm sorry the print is so small, that's just the way it is in the book. And then we get a recurrence or a varied form of the introductory idea further down the page. And then we get a theme B, represented only by 2 chords, but interestingly, is based on Mozart, actually. Which is an outline of the intervals of Susanna's aria dei Vieni, transposed into A major, from Marriage of Figaro. Then at the bottom you can see that we arrive at a dominant chord, which you can see in the middle of the page, that this development of this theme actually ends, interestingly, on a dominant chord. We get it here. Is what Messiaen calls fourths chords. Well, if you turn over onto your page 3, you can see what became of that. The introductory theme is simply deleted and abandoned. Theme B is then moved. It forms the introduction to the fourth movement, the Amen of Desire. And we're left with something really quite different. We've got theme A still, right in the base of the piano, the theme of creation. And those fourth chords now to be played at the top of the first piano on the edge of silence. Etc. And the second piano playing right in the bass. I should really play it more quietly than that. Almost it's like just a kind of noise at that level in the piano and that level of dynamic. And the whole piece is a crescendo. It's a continuous crescendo as the theme moves up the piano, and gradually the chords, which you might think of as sort of chips of matter floating in the void, something like that, waiting to be formed into something, they gradually respond to the crescendo. And it does indeed end on a dominant chord which propels us into the rest of the work. It's interesting that this theme of creation comes back as a sort of leitmotif, and finally, sort of gorgeously, in the final movement, where you can imagine the whole of creation sort of marching up the hill to paradise or something. Rhythmic canons. So we see two things I think from this. One is that the final idea is a simplification of the sketch, considerable simplification, but actually something much stronger. And the second is the way that Messiaen reviews his sketch material and then finds some new possibilities in it. Well, I said there were no sketches, but if you turn to page 4, you can see what we do have. Messiaen was an inveterate scribbler in his diary. He had small pocket engagement diaries, which were so full of engagements, appointments, that they are almost indecipherable. But when he was waiting for the metro or the bus or whatever it was, he would scribble ideas down, and these are just from the diaries. So if you look at the first one, 1944, he's in the middle of writing the Marigato solo piano, but he's thinking now of an orchestral piece with the orchestra. Think of the rhythmic personalities of The Rite of Spring, which was a sort of favourite key work for Messiaen. One rhythmic character is immobile, while the other waxes and wanes, and you could see that, of course, in the Danse Sacrale, where you get whatever it is. That always remains the same, but the alternate material is either a 5/16 or a 2/16 or whatever. Hence all those changes of time. But anyway, and various things like that. Then, in 1946, large orchestra, write a ballet on time. It is night on stage, a dance, a man completely still, the creation of time. An angel with a rainbow head enters with fearsome head, eyes rolled upwards to the beyond and so on. Chords and resonances like those in my quartet. And first mention of serialism here. A serial theme, giving a series of 12 notes, a series of timbre. One timbre for each note and one duration, one nuance or dynamic for each note. Develop timbre, durations and nuances. In other words, the other parameters of music besides pitch. Develop those according to the principles of serialism. And I've given you something from later in Messiaen's career to show that this kind of speculative writing in the diaries goes on. There's something from Transfiguration of the 1960s. Well, on your next sheet, here's an example of that new way with serialism. It's from the piano piece Canti of Jaya, which Messiaen wrote in the late summer of 1949 while he was teaching on the course of Tanglewood. And you can see here he combines three different modes, or if you prefer, series. So the top stave the durations run from 1 to 8 demisemiquavers, and we have a scale of 8 notes, if you like, and a rather uninteresting scale of dynamics, just 2 of them. And the middle stave operates in a similar way, but using semiquavers, 1 to 8 in semiquavers. The lowest stave operates in quavers. Now, the really important thing is that each note, each pitch has its unique sort of envelope of duration and dynamic. So that very first note we hear, the D natural up there, is always that, a demisemiquaver, and always pianissimo. And you can scan your eye down the page and verify that that is so. So all of them remain the same. And then how they're actually deployed is entirely freely up to the composer. It's not serial in the sense of following and ordering. It's Messiaen's own take on it. But I suppose the important thing at the time was that he was organising rhythm and dynamic on a par with pitch. And the effect is that these little points of sound, I'll try and play it. As a kind of expressive shaping. Now, what happened next? Well, I refer you back to your page 1. You can see that he wrote these 4 works, 2 for piano, Canti of Jaya, and the 4 studies in rhythm. The famous one of that is the first one, Mode de valeur d'intensité, which uses not 3 modes as there, but a 4th one, which is attack. So it's staccato, legato, portato, and so on. And then these 2 organ works, Messe de la Pentecôte, the Pentecost Mass, and the Livre d'Orgue. Deeply speculative, strangely beautiful music. And then, at the height of what you might call Messiaen's avant-garde phase, and by the way, Boulez wrote to John Cage, Boulez, who'd been a pupil, of course, of Messiaen in the 1940s, wrote to John Cage and said, Messiaen was really coming on very well, his music was really developing in an interesting way, which I think was a tad patronising to the composer of Turangalîla, but never mind. And you get Messiaen, who was not very good with machinery or the old technology, writing a piece of musique concrète, taped music, a timbre durée, March 1982, and then rather the opposite of that, this piece for flute and piano, Le Malinois, which many of you may know, which was written for a competition at the Paris conservatoire. And that seems to have touched something off in Messiaen's mind. It was a kind of catalyst to go and develop something further. Well, he'd already given plenty of clues to this because birdsong is in Messiaen's music all the way back into the 1930s. But it's very much symbolic birdsong rather than realistic birdsong, you might say. But in that 1948 press interview that I mentioned earlier, the interviewer had said to Messiaen, Monsieur Messiaen, could you tell me, which composers have most influenced your music? And the answer he gave was, the birds. He went on to describe how he would go out into the countryside with a pencil and manuscript paper and write down a song. So it was obviously a desire to get very close to birdsong, to really see what's going on in birdsong, was already there. But early in 1952, he consulted his publisher, Alouette Lulu, and Lulu gave him the name of a man called Jacques Delama, who lived down in southwest France and was a very noted French ornithologist. Delama was actually by profession producer of cognac and lived in a large house in the middle of the country between the town of Cognac and the town of Jarnac, which is also a town that produces cognac, if you see what I mean. And in fact, Delama HQ was, and for all I know, still is in Jarnac, and you can go and see it if you're in that part of France. And you can still buy Delama cognac, and it's fantastically expensive, I may say, but very delicious. And I remember when I was researching Messiaen at this time, bought a bottle in Jarnac as, for research purposes. Anyway, so he went down there, and what the really important thing that arose was that Delama gave him a lot of ornithological knowledge that he didn't have, but he also recommended to Messiaen that he keep his birdsong notations in specially designated notebooks, the Cahier de notation des chants d'oiseaux. Right, so if you go back to your page 6, here's a page from the Cahier. Now I must tell you I discovered for myself, the Cahier. I was working in the Messiaen apartment, and Yvonne Laurier said to me, the one thing that's very precious with Messiaen that I don't have here because it takes up too much space are his birdsong notebooks. And I sort of mentally thought, oh yeah, would I be interested in that? Anyway, she said, you must go and look at them. And I loaned them to the National Library. Go along there and have a look at them. So I did. I went along to the National Library, and I found that there were 303 of them. So it's a big collection. It covers the last 40 years of Messiaen's life. So starting now, actually in May 1952. And I discovered from the work they were absolutely fascinating. Fortunately, one is able to look at them on microfilms because the Bibliothèque Nationale has incomprehensible rules about the amount of material you're allowed to look at on any one occasion. But you can, on each day, look at 10 microfilms. So it would take you just over 30 days to see the lot. Anyway, I discovered a lot of interesting things in these early Cahiers. For a start, Messiaen's notations of birdsong were pretty much what you or I would do if we went out into the forest and started noting down a blackbird or a nightingale. They weren't, frankly, terribly advanced, which makes me rather wonder about previous claims about notating birdsong. But they very, very rapidly developed and become extremely sophisticated. Now, the other marvellous thing about it was that I discovered that obviously Messiaen's mind worked rather well out of doors, like all of us do, and he would use these cahiers for other purposes, to write kind of messages to himself, memoranda and so on, but also to make musical sketches. And here we are, 1953, a musical sketch. Well, what Messiaen was on about here is he's been commissioned to write a piano concerto for the Donaueschingen Festival, a very important commission scheduled for October 1953. You won't believe it, but his very first idea, which he wrote in one of his diaries, was he was going to write a kind of the ultimate serial piece, and every single note on the piano was going to have its own unique kind of pitch dynamic, touch, articulation, etc. envelope. The mind boggles as to what this would sound like. Fortunately, this never got off the drawing board. And then in 1953, something completely different. This tremendously over-the-top kind of birdsong concerto with lots of, full of gestures and so on and so forth. You can see, rather interestingly, 3/4 of the way down the page on the right, he reminds himself to look at Gaspard La Nuit and Miroir. And he reminds himself that they're both for piano, something he might have perhaps remembered without having to note it down. But anyway, he was a man who always crossed every T and dotted every I. Anyway, this is sort of a kind of over-the-top thing. But what's really interesting is that, again, this didn't get off the drawing board either. Messiaen obviously chucked it away and thought, no, if I'm going to write a concerto, it's going to be about bird songs, that's what I'm really interested in, and it's going to be in a new way, a way that's actually truthful to nature, to bird songs. And this sort of Turangalîla-like effusion is not where I am now. So he simply jettisoned that. Of course, when I was looking at the cahier, I was most interested to find the places where you could find a birdsong notation that related to an actual work by Messier. I was probably only the second person in the world, other than Messier, who had ever seen these books. The first person, fortunately, had been Loriot, who, before she gave them all to the National Library, had helpfully annotated bits where she would say, "Si rêver des oiseaux, figure M," or something like that, you know, and she would actually write it in, which made my task rather easier. But the extraordinary thing there was that Messier was in Rêver, undoubtedly true as he saw it, to birds, because you could see a notation of a blackbird, and then you could track it through to the score of Rêver, and remarkably, it is virtually identical. What he wrote down when he heard with the bird, that was what went into the score. The art in Rêver is the orchestration, the ordering of the birdsong, and so on and so forth, combining and so on. But the actual birdsong was left completely unchanged. It was almost as if, to Messiaen, this was a sort of sacred received text from nature. And that follows through in his dealings with the director, Reinhard Ströber. When Messiaen sent him the program notes for the finished work, he sent a huge list of all the birds taking part with all their names in different European languages and Latin as well. But he said, "I'm enclosing no biography of myself. I wish to disappear behind the birds." So it's as if this piece is by the birds, not by Messiaen. He's merely the vehicle who's taken it down and is then passing it on to us. Well, now, you can see that this is riddled with inconsistencies, because of course the notation that Messiaen wrote down was a blackbird filtered through Messiaen's musical imagination and also the practicalities of the time and so on and so forth. And it had to be arranged for human musical instruments, etc., etc. But that's what Messiaen thought, and that is the party line that he stuck to in the face, I have to say, of the evidence. Well, we'll look at the evidence now. We go on to your sheet 7. Sheet 7. Okay, well now this was an exciting piece of research because this is a cahier from 1954, and it immediately struck me because we have a title at the top, Birds of the North Woods, in English, a language which Messiaen denied being able to speak and certainly never used. And the birds titled here are all American birds, and they're very short excerpts. So it didn't take a genius to realise that these are recordings, not live birds, and that this is the list of the birds from the recording. So I went down to the Sound Archive in the British Library, and there's an ornithology section, and I said to them, well, here we are, 1954, Messier. How many recorded anthologies were there in existence at that time of American bird songs? I had no idea. It might have been 30 or 300 or what, I don't know. Turned out there were 3. And there was a wonderful eureka moment when I found the one that corresponded to the order of this list, that clearly corresponded to these notations. And the director of the Sound Archive at that time, Tim Day, very kindly said he would put a blue plaque up above my desk at this moment. Anyway, but here we are. So and this is quite an old one. These were 78s, produced in 1941. Okay, let's hear the first three birds in this page.
Some birds of the North Woods recorded by the Laboratory of Ornithology at Cornell University. First, an olive-backed thrush sings. Next, the theory. The wood thrush.
Interesting. You can see that there's quite a lot of creative intervention going on, as of course there would be. And these are very short excerpts, and what Messier has written here is clearly a sort of aide-memoire, you know, it's a little catalogue of the bird songs. If you go on to your next sheet, or next three sheets really, that's 8, 9 and 10, here is a much more extended notation of a bird called the bobbling. And it's interesting that this page 8 is clearly in Messiaen's fair copy script, and I do wonder whether at this stage he wasn't still thinking of this very much in terms of ornithology rather than writing a piece. But eventually that changed, and he got permission from the Boulez to write a piece for the Domaine Musicale concerts, and he wrote Oiseaux exotiques, or exotic birds. Which was originally entirely based on American birds. Well, here's a first notation of the bobbling. Obviously, as you will have guessed, the great advantage to Messier working from recordings was he could listen to them over and over again, and find new things in them. So here is a second notation on your page 9 of the bobbling. And then I've got the printed version of that for you to follow. So we'll just listen to that now. Pin your ears back and concentrate very hard in order to follow this. Excuse me a moment. Again, you can see, I mean, you can see what Messier means, I always feel, but to describe this as he did, unblushingly for the rest of his life, as accurate and totally faithful to the birds seems to be stretching it a bit. Anyway, but what do you do when you're composing with it? Well, if you turn to your page 11, we've got the wood thrush that we heard a moment ago. And the first notation that we heard is at the top of the page. through these 4 phases, the one we've just heard, and then the second one, he's picking up on this interval of a 7, transposing it there, and actually fleshing it out. So we have D flat against C major. Version C takes out a stage further, so we start with D flat with the C chord above it. So you see how that has got transposed down to the bass, and then one of these marvellous Messiaen chords, E major, with those upper notes, and then it's interesting, you can see the way it's, he's made these notes of orchestration, flute and clarinet, maracas and guero, piccolo, tempo block, and piano. At this stage, the piano is simply, I think, an instrument in the ensemble. And then the final version, which is kind of based on version C, but again is a simplification. So this is now just for piano solo. The tempo's been reduced and it's drenched in pedal. And it becomes one of the great moments in Moses Exotique. In fact, it's repeated just towards the end of the piece. And that kind of wonderful E major becomes the sort of central tonality towards which the piece gravitates. But you can see there that my final version, the version that appears in the finished score, has travelled a very long distance from the opening notation. I think we can agree about that. So that's Oiseaux Exotiques. Let's now move swiftly on to the next one, which is Catalogue d'Oiseaux. Here is one of my favourite pages from the cahier. It dates from September 1956. You can see the date up in the top left corner. Again, the dotting of the I's and the crossing of the T's is very evident. The very top left corner, Messiaen, that's the place, the island of Messiaen, which is off the western end of Brittany, and it's at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we see. I've always been thankful that Messiaen was so low tech. You know, any of us coming to this marvellous place, looking at the way the Atlantic is sort of lashing in against the rocky cliffs and so on, would have whipped out our camera or maybe just our phone or something and taken a photograph and then kind of moved on. Messiaen had to sit down and actually write down his impressions, and as he did so, they get more and more, shall we say, emotionally overheated. So he starts by saying simply, oh, the line of the horizon, I'm looking at the top right corner now, the line of the horizon, white, silvery, shining, luminous, separating the sea from the sky and so on. But it all gets very sort of hyperbolic as we go down, and you get the shape of the rocks catches his eye. They are like the teeth of lions, the tongues of dragons, the snouts of hippopotamus, jaws of crocodiles, geometrical figures and so on and so on. And a bit further down, they're like ghosts, phantoms, ghosts, iguanodons standing upright, cataclysmic, and so on and so on. And the sea, the third of the way down the page, the sea is blue, Prussian blue, or violet, the fury of the waves and so on. And I love the bit just before you get the music, well, there's a drawing of this, wasn't there, on the right-hand side of the rocks, and then just below that, the opposition between the sea, constantly active, and the immobile fury of the rocks. And then we get some musical notation, which is actually his attempt to compose the sound of the sea. We only get a bird right down the bottom. It's a grey wagtail, in fact, right down the bottom of the page. So this is Messiaen arriving in Brittany. And this notebook, 23044 is its catalogue number, is really one of the most precious there is, because while he was in Britain, it seems to be the only manuscript paper he had with him, so it's particularly full of musical sketches. And he'd been working now for 3 years on Catalogue, or at least making notations of it. We first read about it in his diary back in 1953. He's going to compose a series of piano pieces based on birdsong. So he's been going a long time, but he hasn't started to compose. This is what actually happens in this notebook. You can see here, on this page, your page 13, I think we reached, actually these notations refer to 5 of the pieces in the catalogue. The one are these gorgeous chords at the top, if I can read them. And after that E major chord, you see the word l'oreille. That is in French means golden oriole. The second piece in the catalogue does that. We get these chords, and these turn into. So the ideas for Le Loriot. About a third of the way down the page, you can see in the margin avant la hulotte, before the hulotte, which is a type of owl, tawny owl. Pour la peur et la nuit, for fear and the night. In other words, these sort of these kind of dark clusters at the base of the piano, they're intended to depict the night, but also evoke in us a feeling of terror. You have halfway down the page, you see big chords of C minor. That's for a piece called the Curly Cendre, or Curlew, and those upward quasi-glissandos are the sort of whooping call of the curlew, and so on. So you can see this is a page, a sort of scattergun of ideas for sketches. Now I want to concentrate on the first piece to be composed, the Alouette Lulu, or Woodlark. This is your page 14 now. And I've quoted at the top the preface to the printed score. Messiaen's preface is always wonderful, I think. They're sort of prose poems. He gives the details of where we are in the Forêt, which is an area in central France near the Massif Central. Pine woods to the right of the road, meadows to the left. High in the sky, in the darkness, the woodlark peel off 2 by 2 from the flock. A chromatic, fluid descent. Hidden in a thicket in a clearing in the wood, a nightingale responds. Its biting tremolo is set in contrast with the mysterious voice on high. A woodlark invisible draws near, fades. The trees and fields are dark and still. It is midnight. Well, this is a kind of poetic version of a real experience which you see on page 15 from the Cahier for 14th of July 1956. Not at midnight, but at 19 hours, so at 7 o'clock in the evening on the July evening. It would still have been pretty light, not dark at all. But it's in the place anyway, and at 18 hours, 6 o'clock, saw a woodlark, Alouette Lulu, perched on the branch of a tree. Unfortunately, it flew away immediately, almost immediately. But then at 7 o'clock, the song of the Alouette Lulu, the chant doux, soft, gentle, flûté, flute-like, limpid, very lié, joined together, un peu plaintif, a little plaintive, so describing the emotion of the song. And you can see these chromatic descents and so on, which the piece consists of a series, if you like, a woodlark song anyway, variations on this, what he calls liquid chromatic descent. If you look on the next page, I was going to play you a little snippet of this, but I must press on. I see by looking at my watch, so I wait, but never mind. The reason that Messiaen was able to write that previous page in a way so exactly when he heard the woodlark in the Forêt was he had already studied it in detail from discs. And this is more and more part of the pattern of Messiaen's life in his later decades when he was from the early to mid-60s, he became a kind of global figure really and was invited to Japan and the United States, Israel, finally famously to Australia in 1988. he would always study in advance the birdsong native to those countries, and he was sort of, as it were, prepped for it when he went. And he would then factor into his tour meetings with ornithologists and tours of bird reserves. So anyway, he knew all about the woodlark because he'd already studied it in these recordings, which were made by a man called Ludwig Koch, and they're more songs of wild birds. This was a British production, and so this is a British or English and Southern English woodlark, and you can see very, very similar figurations. Now this notation, combined with the notations in the wild, are then what is used in the finished piece. But how do we get to that? Well, if you look at your page 17, this is a simply, I think, marvellous page, because Messiaen clearly only had one cahier with him. The notations he was making in Ouessant, in Brittany, were proceeding forwards like that. And at the back of the cahier, he was jotting down these sketches that we've been looking at. And gradually they were kind of meeting in the middle. Well, they met at page 17. And by this point he'd run out of manuscript paper. Hence the writing is very spidery and very untidy. May even have been some of this written on the train going back to Paris, I speculate. But anyway, the notation at the very top, where you can see sort of rumblings in the bass of, I'm saying the bass of the piano because that's what they became, but anyway, rumblings in the bass with these clusters of sharpened notes and then white note clusters in the right hand, as it were. This is the bruit du ressac, which is the noise of the surf. So it's the last notation he made on the beach in Brittany. Then in the top right corner, you can just see to accompany the Lorient, and those chords that we looked at earlier, those dominant second chords, and then the triad E major, and then the song of the Lorient. We get there quarter of the way down the left-hand side. Then three chords representing night, moving outwards chromatically. They're ditched, but below that Lorient song, we get forest, la nuit, night, pour la Lulu, for the Alouette Lulu. And we get these chords, and if your eyesight is very sharp, better than mine. Well, look at the very bottom line of this page. In the middle, you can see the word Suédois, Swedish. That means that in what he's sketching here is in fact a kind of chorale with pauses, and in the pauses there's going to be birdsong. And the Suédois means something from the Swedish discs, as Messiaen called them, which was a huge anthology put out in the 50s by Swedish radio. But on the line above that, you can see the word rossignol, perhaps, I don't know, about 2 inches in. You can see, I can just see a capital R, rossignol, anyway, and there are more rossignols as you go along. So rossignol, that's the one that's striking up in that figurative material of wood that I read about earlier. So it's kind of super important page, that. And now if you look at your page 18, you can see that chorale chords, which I've transcribed. Well, I haven't transcribed, actually, I've cut it with scissors out of the published store, but believe me, these notes are identical to what you just seen sketched there. And this is in the order he sketched it. So we start with this rather long phrase, K in B flat major, and then gradually, as the page goes on, so if you look towards the end of the third system, you can begin to see a shape emerging. So we get this, gosh, I can't read, and then a sequence. So that's the top of the arc. Then we descend. So on. So you can see a shape beginning to emerge as he goes on, but then he reviewed that, and we get the shape as we have it in the final piece of the chorale. This is without the birdsong. And you can see that we start on the top line of music with what you might call an exposition. So we have that cadence in B flat, with the bass line going chromatically. Messiaen cadence of trident, the natural down to B flat, goes somewhere else, and then it comes back to that B flat major chord. That's the swept position. Then we have the development starting with this rising sequence here. We then have the descent, and then we have a longer phrase that ends in a kind of harmonic crisis, a major chord in the right hand, but a D flat in the left. And something has to be done with that dissonance, that instability. I don't know whether Messiaen realised this was a possibility when he made the first sketch in the train. I think probably not. He now realises that if he reorders the segments in the correct way, what he's going to get is a continuous chromatic scale down from that D flat right down to the bottom of the piano. It's actually rather a marvellous effect. So you get the phrase which ends in a kind of crisis. That's the sort of very end of the piece where the nightingale, which is very abrasive sort of bird, has fallen silent. You get the woodlark as his own. But the soloist, in fact, is the chord, the chorale, which at the beginning we understand as being accompaniment. Now it seems to me, because of this huge chromatic descent, it takes centre stage. That's really, and the woodlark is just a kind of descant. Anyway, pressing on, yes, perhaps I have about 10 minutes to go. I want to look at just one other piece from the catalogue. This is from the Quatre, which is translated to black-eared wheatio. This is a Mediterranean bird. It's down on that corner below Perpignan towards the Spanish border. And this is where Messiaen collected this song, marvellous place, near a little town called Banyuls. Three of the pieces actually in Catalogue have come from here, the sketches for this were made in June 1957. That's important because we are now into the second half of composition of the Catalogue. He wrote 7 pieces over the winter of 1956-57. They were ready by March 57. And then he started, that might have been the complete work, but he then started again in May, June in 1957. And then there was this visit down to the Mediterranean setting, which was a complete revelation for Messiaen. I tell you, it was just stunningly beautiful place. In fact, the first time I went to see Messiaen, I was naturally very kind of nervous and shy and all that kind of thing. And I blurted out that the Quatre, études was my favourite piece from Catalogue, which of course, I moment after those words I realised this was a terrible gaffe. You must never tell a composer that such and such is your favourite piece, because it sort of implies you might not like the other ones. But anyway, he was most kind and said it was his favourite piece too. I pass that on for what it's worth. Anyway, going on to your page 21. The reason I've chosen this piece is that we have an amazingly detailed idea from the cahiers how Messiaen wrote this piece. It's really almost without equal in Messiaen's, easily without equal actually. We know exactly because he appears to have composed it in situ, on the cliff tops overlooking the Messiaen. And this, he resorted to these, what I call prose plans. So if you follow down the left-hand margin, you can see the numbers 1, 2, 3, etc. Well, 1, 2, and 3 are described as couplets. So of couplet 1 is several bird songs, and couplet 2 is then a variant on that, the same bird songs but mixed up and in different, in varied form. Couplet 3 the same. Then you get 4 sections of DEV, in other words, development, which in fact in the programme for the piece are following the rising of the sun from dawn, 5 o'clock in the morning, to midday, when you get the most brilliant virtuoso birds singing, particularly a bird called the Quatre, which is the Fitle lark. So that takes us forward. And then there was going to be section 8, a reprise of the first page. You can just see that reprise, page 1, and always different, and finishing there. Then he seems to have felt the need to add a coda, because we can see where the number 9 is. If you go sort of up and a little bit to the right, you can see the words peut-être, perhaps, coucher du soleil, a sunset. So we would get some kind of symmetry in the piece. But this caused Messiaen no end of trouble. If you go forward to actually page 23, you can see roughly what happened. The last part of the piece was radically revised and enlarged. So first it was a musical sketch with a new element, the sunset, was to be followed by brief reminiscences of birdsong with a new ending. Messiaen wasn't very satisfied with this because, perhaps rather pedantically, he said, well, for formal reasons, the musical text does not always follow the chronology of the day's events. In other words, it wasn't true to nature. So he revised that again, and the revision, which gives us the final piece, has 3 elements. So we start with a recall of the beginning, and then a recall of the middle, which is the sunrise. Not obviously recalled as a sunrise, but as a sunset, but recalls it. And then a coda, which is dominated by a chorale, which paints the colours of the sky above the foothills of the Pyrenees to the west, and with the birdsong fragmenting into the darkness. Now, if you look at your page 24, you can see at the top of the page the chords, the big chords of the sunset. If you track the bass line, I see ourselves on the C sharp, B flat, G natural, down to E. So E is the target, but in fact, we will skip forward, and I'll just say in parentheses, page 25 shows you in the lower half of the page is fantastic duet for 2 goldfinches, which had featured rather modestly earlier on, but now are really let off the leash. This is in the reprise of the opening part of the piece, but it's always varied. It's a fantastic creative achievement, constant variation going on. And then on your page 26, we start to see the chorale, for instance, a third of the way down, if I can read it. On that fabulous chord of E, first inversion with a favourite Messiaen sound, a C sharp. Messiaen would have said, because the C sharp makes E major even more major, if you like, it kind of raises it. Let me just illustrate that from the score. Point is that what happens is, I said that the the sunset going down that sequence of chords to end on E, but in fact it doesn't. He withholds that chord. There's a sort of gap that waits to be filled. And when we finally get there, when after various bird calls, then there's a silence, and then we start this meditation on the colours of the sky. And a fragment of birdsong. But we're always coming back to that chord. That's the chord that's missing, that we get to. And that is set up at the beginning of the piece. Right, yes, okay. Turn to your page 27, which is looking at the very beginning of the piece. You'll notice here something that I think is very interesting and important, just how detailed this is. All the phrasing, all the dynamics, all that is in place, even those little numbers you can see, which represent the pianist's fingering. So Messier actually worked out how you're going to play this music as he's still composing it. It's actually remarkable. I'll come back to that in a moment. Then there's the same music you will see on your page 28. And what I want to just draw attention to here is the establishing of this sort of sound, this kind of basic E major added sixth sound, which is the kind of core sound of the piece. Well, it's prefigured here. The note I want you to concentrate on is the G sharp in the left hand at the end of the second line of music, right? And the beautiful way that is actually set up. We have a little sequence at the beginning, which rather fancifully describes the terracing of the vineyards as it goes down towards the sea. Our sequence. And then this chord of E minor. Those added notes here. And a very prominent E here. This is our solo bird, the Turangalîla, which is extremely kind of, well, he says proud and brusque. Yeah, it's very aggressive sort of sounding bird. Anyway, there. And then this wonderful chord, which is actually partly derived from Alban Berg, funnily enough, Alban Berg's opera Wozzeck. It's a favourite borrowing of Messiaen's. And you get those fifths in the bass. And the G natural, of course. You hold that sound in the third pedal. Something to me fantastically beautiful about that cadence onto the G sharp, and then we get a bird. So having sort of found that G sharp, we get it, which is clearly this E chord with other notes in the melody. You know what I mean? You can hear that sound, yes? And Messiaen very clearly makes us differentiate between two sort of counts of harmony. There's the very dissonant ones, like the Turangalîla itself, and this bird we've just heard, well, those two birds, the first one is the ortolan bunting, and this one is the spectacled warbler. And then there's this is the gull. So those are the very harsh, dissonant birds, and then we go, and then the goldfinch, which will be so fantastically enlarged later. Anyway, that's just a few ideas about this piece. I think it really is one of the masterpieces of the Catalogue d'Oiseau. I was perhaps justified to say Messier was my favourite piece, and it's simply a tour de force of composition, and I think particularly that extraordinary sensitivity of ear to the harmonic colour that Messier had, but also the fantastic degree of invention whereby you get these birds over and over and over and over again, and they're always different, they're always developing. So the final thing I want to do is just to finish off, and I think I'll get a hit tape more or less at the right time. is to look at your last couple of pages, page 30, because this was a discovery that I made. It was a kind of reward for conscientiousness, if you like, because I was now looking at the cahiers, many visits to Paris later. I was now looking at the cahiers for 1961. I didn't expect to find anything interesting because 1961 is a very curious year. It's a year in which Messiaen composed absolutely nothing. But is that true? Well, here we are. So, to my astonishment, I opened one of the cahiers and found the bottom half, you can see, there's not a birdsong notation at all. It's clearly composing. And there was about a dozen pages of this, fantastically difficult to read. Passerinet, that's a bird. It became in the end this piece which is advertised as having been reconstructed by Peter Hill. There we are. And actually, rather than I say, I must get a good commercial break here. It doesn't earn me any money, I can assure you. It's published by Faber's, so it's kind of about a fifth or a sixth of the price you pay for Messiaen's music when published by French publishers. This is about 10 quid for this, okay, so you really can't afford it. Anyway, so it was an unknown Messiaen piano piece. There's a sort of interesting story about how I reconstructed it, because some bits, the beginning and the end, were clearly complete. It was the only problem was how to read them. The middle bit had lots of different segments, but they were joined up by a rather complicated alphabetical scheme. And there was one bit where I had to, which was just block harmonies, but was clearly not intended to be block harmonies, and I had to go back to the cahiers where the notations that fed into this sketch came from, and I used the cahiers a lot for things like dynamics and also rhythms as well, where he was obviously using a composing shorthand. It's interesting that, as you can see this page 30, the sort of miscellaneous way in which he was using these cahiers. The top bit is all about his traité, which I told you was an obsession. And he's talking about painting. C. Delaunay, Robert Delaunay is a favourite artist of his, and also Blanc Gatti, a Swiss artist whose work Messiaen owned a few paintings by him actually. Looking at rhythms and colours, these chords, typical Messiaen chords, and where you find them in my works, a list of his works and so on. And then you can just about see a faint wavy line across the page, and underneath that, he starts talking about an inch in Voix, 7th of May, 1961, Nizas, N-I-Z-A-S, which is a village near Pézenas, not too far from Montpellier, going back to obviously the notations that he'd made in the countryside there. And indeed, as I said, I found those and was able to, as it were, incorporate their dynamics and sometimes rhythms and so on into the finished reconstruction. And you can see that bit you've just seen there in manuscript goes into score looking like that. There's only one change, but I've added the instruction or the timbre métallique et flûté comes actually from one of the cahier notations. It's not in that sketch there, but I added that in and confessed up to it in preface, so I've been played fair and all the rest of it. But anyway, there it is. We might just hear the beginning of that actually, Larry. Friends, the little bit you just heard, in fact, is the woodlark. I was talking about them together, that little chromatic descent. And they're all different from the way they were a few years earlier. So this is Messiaen 1961. He always said to me I intended to write a second catalogue, but I never found the time to do it. But evidently, in that fallow year, he was actually starting a new catalogue, and this is this one piece that we have. Just to wind up, you know, I was saying, well, how Messiaen composed, I don't think I quite lived up to that title, but I maybe showing you some of the things he did. Just to remind ourselves, some of the principles involved in Messiaen's composing. This idea of simplifying ideas to go to something much stronger. Not just working with detail, but also thinking of the very big idea, thinking in the biggest possible scale. Those excerpts I showed you from the diaries. The importance to Messiaen of going out and notating birdsong. I think this was absolutely vital to him. It was a very, very difficult time of his life. Very difficult for personal reasons too, because his wife, his first wife, Claire, had become in the late 1940s seriously ill. She was only in her 40s herself, but she was suffering from some very early onset dementia. She eventually died in 1959. So it was a really terrible time personally for Messiaen. And this going out into nature, working directly from nature, was tremendously important to him because as we saw, his notations are not some kind of scientific, he always denied that he was a scientist. He said he approached birds as an artist, of course. But they are a kind of his response, if you like, to birdsong. I mean, I would compare it to somebody who was a poet, but also works translating poetry from other languages. And as they do say, that's another kind of poetry. So constantly, this was a creative act, even if in itself it wasn't composing a piece. Nonetheless, it was a form of composing. So that was very important. I think those great prose sketches, particularly where Messiaen works out the architecture of a piece, those were clearly very, very important to him. Reviewing his material and seeing new possibilities. We've seen that, I think, several times, haven't we? How important that was to him. The final thing I would say, and it's kind of advice to students, or at least advice to postgrads maybe, is you notice the extraordinary level of finish even in sketches. Messiaen was a busy man. If he could get something right now, he would get it right now. Cross every T, dot every I. And you saw him even putting in the figure. Well, why not? Why not actually get it right now? If it's possible to do so. When I was still in post at Sheffield University, used to labour with postgrad students who had done a doctorate or something. They'd say to me, oh, I'm going to do grad, I'm going to do 3 years research and then I'll spend a year writing it up. And I would say to them, when you write it up while you're doing your research, write it up while it's fresh in your mind, write it up while you're excited about it. Don't wait 3 years when you've forgotten all about it, and it comes out sort of stilted. Do it now. You can always revise it later, but do it now, get it right now. I think Messiaen has a kind of moral for us somewhere there. Anyway, I'm sorry I've gone on so long. Thank you very, very much indeed for your attention.
Messiaen worked, and the detail is amazing, actually. It's phenomenal. I mean, I've seen various sketches of a number of composers, but this is so much information in there. And actually the skill in deciphering it, it's sort of almost a code, but I guess you probably tuned in so much.
You kind of do get with my eyesight as well, but you do get used to his kind of shorthand, and you need to know a little bit of French anyway. As I say, you get better at it. But it is fantastic. The Caius are fantastic. I think they're one one of the most amazing documents in musical history, actually, I would say, without exaggeration. And because they have so much in them, not only birdsong, which is what I thought it purely contained, but all these sketches for pieces and stuff, really absolutely fantastic, give you an incredible insight into Messiaen's mind. I do ask myself sometimes whether I should feel guilty about kind of talking about the guy. It's clearly something Messiaen would have wanted to keep absolutely secret. He would be horrified, I think. But I don't think it, I think in a way adds to our appreciation of Messiaen, and I think actually looking at some of the ways in which he spurred on his creativity at a time when, as I said, his wife was very ill, but I think he probably felt also artistically after the achievements leading up to and including Turangalîla, that he needed badly to come up for fresh air and to renew his language. And the way he did this in two ways, and firstly this sort of inventing his own type of serialism, but then going on to going out into nature. I think it's an incredibly courageous thing to do. I mean, to reach the age of 40, to become commissioned by the Boston Symphony Orchestra to write a symphony, you know, to be that sort of successful and just to abandon everything, to start again, it is pretty amazing. Anyway, so you probably have questions.
I'm sure we do, and I don't know who wants to go first, but there's so much to discuss. So who would like to ask the first question? Anna.
Thank you, that was amazing. The ornithology discs, where would he have sourced them from, or where would he have heard them?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, because the disc with the birds for audacious, the American birds, are from a disc called, anthology called American Birdsongs. He might have picked them up on two occasions. He was in America at the end of the 1940s, the teaching at Tanglewood, and a few months later the premiere of Turangalîla in Boston. He might have picked them up then, but I think more likely that he got them at the beginning of 1954, when he noted in his diary a gift from his friend Mio of some discs of birdsong. Messiaen, as I said, was very low tech, and it amazingly not occurred to Messiaen that birdsong existed not only out there in the forest, but actually had been recorded. I mean, the English discs, the Ludwig Koch discs, they go back to the 1930s, for example. And as I said, the American birdsong was 1941, so this stuff had been kind of out there. I mean, once he got going, as I said, recording became incredibly important. He always downplayed that. I mean, Messiaen was extremely unreliable witness to his own work. I mean, rather like, say, the Quartet at the time was first performed in front of an audience of 5,000 people. It was always a suspiciously biblical figure, anyway. And it was, in fact, more like 300 because it was indoors, you know. Yes, he always downplayed use of recordings. He said it's not the same thing. You've got to hear a bird in one sound. I'm sure you have. But of course, there are these huge advantages, and they transformed him as a composer because instead of, as in Revelius was, taking the bird's notation, which obviously there was only one of, as a sort of holy writ, and it's what I call Messiaen's fundamentalist phase. You know, it wasn't exotic. Initially, he was making several notations of the same, finding different things. So no one of them was, as it were, sacred. So, in other words, what happened was the musician, thank goodness, got the upper hand over the ornithologist, and you know, the rest is history, as you might say. But so those so the American birdsong, I think they came his way in 1954. I mean, the interesting thing was that obviously he intended audacious to be purely based on these American birds. There was a bird called the red cardinal, which is on these discs, and he had heard that one live because it was in a private, not menagerie, what's it called, aviary in Paris, which he visited and made pages of notes on. But then, of course, he got sort of hijacked really because late in 1955, with only 3 or 4 months to go before the premiere of the Musicale, there was an exhibition of tropical birds in the middle of Paris because he had to go days writing all that, filling notebooks with it, and he couldn't resist bringing them in. So that's why in audacious you get this sort of incongruity that you've got all these American birds, but you've got East Asian birds as well. And part of the point about the piece is the way these are set up against each other. But and also there were different techniques. So when you have pages and pages and pages of live notation, he started to kind of cherry pick from that and then develop things within it. Whereas these excerpts on the American bird songs, because it's 78 RPM records, we're trying to get 6 birds on each side, so that's 6 birds in 1.5 minutes or something. The excerpts are necessarily very, very short. So then that you develop. And so it's absolutely wonderful. I mean, that's why we wrote a book about it, about Was es so deep, because at the back of these covers, you've got pages and pages of developing the stuff or renotating it. So fantastic to watch the creative mind of watching it, as it were, the finished sculpture emerging from the stone. Fantastic.
More questions?
I thought that was great. I'm just wondering if, because I think a lot of birds don't really sing in the tempered chromatic scale, and with something like a violin, there's more access to the notes in between.
Yes.
I wonder if you ever considered that.
I mean, this is a very good point. Messiaen maintained that he in print anyway, now I think you want to take this as a huge picture of sort, he maintained that there was a sort of scientific method to notating birdsong, and that he would transpose it from these very high registers, and that he would, as he did so, expand the intervals, and then he would adjust it to, temper tuning and all the rest of it. But your point is also, why did he particularly use the piano? Well, obviously because of Laureat, he had somebody who could play this stuff. But one could see that the piano could encompass so much. I mean, it has that fantastic brilliance in the upper register, and with her playing, you can have more than one bird going on at the same time. And then the first two of the purely birdsong works are for piano and orchestra, so Reveille's was as a motif. He then had, I think, a real problem writing for solo piano. That's why he took so long getting to the point of actually starting composing, because he didn't know how he was going to do it. And there was a sort of epiphany, in fact, in 1955, when he and Laureat went down to Messier had a home just 15 miles south of Grenoble in view of the Alps. And he went down to write down birdsong, but it was so cold that the birds hadn't sort of come out yet or something like that. So he filled his cahier with wonderful descriptions of scenery, not birdsong. And then I think it was when he went to Brittany, as we saw in cahier 23044, and that page where there's this whole page talking about sea and rocks and the colours and the shapes and so on and so forth. I think he realised that the answer was to embed the birdsong in descriptions of scenery, which you don't get in Was es exotique or Reveille's, or whether they're purely birdsong. So that gave another dimension, and again, of course, the piano could do that superbly. I mean, the boom and crash that you can get at the base of the piano, for example, and so it became the perfect vehicle, really, for the catalogue. Was it? And as I say, Laurier's brilliance was something that he could simply take for granted. I mean, she was really absolutely amazing. I mean, he like all composers do, I mean, he gave her the solo piano part of Reveille des Oiseaux a week before the performance in Don Ocean, and she learned it and memorised it in a week. I mean, it's just sort of incredible, you could do that with her. She did actually balk at, there was a performance of the Catalogue as it then was, with the first 7 pieces, in March 1957 in Paris. And the biggest piece, the Reed Warbler, La Bousserole et Favart, she said, I don't have time to learn this. And she didn't play it. And in fact, Messier withdrew it and considerably revised it. So that might be a good thing with the lines and drawn up. But anyway, that's the only instance I can think of Laureat showing some kind of human frailty in this. But yeah, that's why he was concentrating on the piano.
So if it weren't for Loriot, we would have
Perhaps
more works for other instruments.
Indeed, yes, indeed. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree, it's a shame, but we only have the theme of variations, marvellous though that is, very early work, and of course the fantastic movement at the end of the quartet and so on.
Just a brief variation of that theme, because I wondered if you could expand a little bit on the tempo mécanique thing. It's like the thing that I find most jarring between the recordings and the piano is the tempo, the sort of tempo range that you have from the piano. And is this a kind of language that he developed to sort of translate that somehow into his piano?
Well, this was really what I was kind of talking about, that he maintained that there was a sort of science.
Sure. I just wondered if there was any, if he used language like this, if he tried to, how did he try and confer that in a way rather than just dots and lines on the page to perform it? Is there any way that he used descriptions like these words to kind of get that across?
I see what you mean. Do you mean to get across the performers and get across the listener?
Exactly.
Well, it's full of that. I mean,
Right.
the scores of the Catalogue, this is where Messiaen scores stop being sort of dull, ordinary scores and become, in fact, works of art. You know, and they're absolutely stunning. I mean, the layout, they should be studied by everybody. It's going to model how you. The fantastic trouble that he took over presentation, scores, proofreading, and so on. And I remember once actually saying to Messiaen, I do wonder, mate, whether this note perhaps it should be a G sharp. And, you know, I mean, implying that there was because there was some inconsistency. You know? And I can't remember whether I was right or not, but again, Frost descended. I'm not allowed to think that there was any wrong. But I mean, you see, there's so much in the scores that tell you about, you know, the timbre and, shall we say, motion of the birdsong as well. There's so much of that in it. I mean, personally, I don't think there was a scientific method at all. I just don't believe that. And I don't think they. I mean, we'd see some signs of that in the Quartet if there were, and there aren't. So I don't do that. It's like also the, sorry, getting away from your question, but it's like this question of Messiaen, his, if I can say the word about synesthesia, you know, this association of colour and sound. I'm not sure that he actually had, I've talked to synesthetes, if that's the word.
Yeah.
I remember talking to a man who was a professor of music actually at Hobart, and he said, thank God I'm talking to you now, and I looked sort of slightly flattered. The reason was because I was wearing a sort of dark blue jumper, and he'd been talking to a lady wearing a bright orange shirt for 20 minutes, and it was absolutely doing his head in, and causing dissonances in here. I don't know Messiaen was either. I think he was fantastically sensitive to colour. We've seen, and I had maybe I managed to demonstrate a lot of that. Fantastic sensitivity to colour. And it became, when I worked with him, I mean, of course it was something I could ask him about, because I'm certainly not synesthetic myself. And I can only say the sort of way he explained it, it all became rather kind of natural. There's a lot of stuff in the Traité which was probably written very late in his life and is not applicable to the earlier works. There's a very, very good chapter actually in the Messier by somebody American about colour, which is very sensible, I think, about it all. But the way he explained it, you know, that it was wonderful. I mean, what is the, I don't know if I can remember it, there's this chord at the middle of Le Laurier. It's basically the sun reaching its end. And I played it like that, sort of beautifully, you know. And he said, no, it's got to sound like a choir of trombones. So I sort of blinked a bit and said, well, how, you know? And it's very simple. You bring out the G sharp and the tenor, you know. Does kind of change the colour, and actually this was something it was really fascinating to think about working with Messier, because you wouldn't really got this from the score. I thought of him as very much an organist, where you clearly you have your what are they called, you know, manuals, you know, and different registrations and so on. But once you're on a manual, that's it really, and the chord is its colour. But he would show me on the piano, he liked me to explore the colour within chords of what you can do with the piano. Of course, it's a slightly privileged that G sharp was actually extraordinary. There were a lot of other places where he showed me that, and it was marvellous in the early stages, where the first couple of years I went to him, he would come forward and play chords on the piano, and it was a beautiful touch. Later on, he was in rather frail health, and he would just sort of be kind of propped in a chair and stay there, you know, but still sharp as a knife, I may say. But anyway, yes, there's this colouring of chords from him within was a sort of lovely aspect to his music. Yeah, yes.
Thank you.
We have a question here.
No, so, by the way, I mean, just a very boring question. So just wonder, because sorry, I'm saying this hard, yeah, but I think one of the work you just mentioned, briefly, you know, the so not put in the music. Just, one thing is, I mean, is there any purpose why, I mean, he applied the bird song in it? Because clearly there are bird songs, but I mean, I haven't been a great fan of the Holy Bible. It seems, I mean, verse.
Yeah.
What's the what? In case you know, like, what's the reason why?
What's it all about? Oh, well, okay, I can answer that very specifically. If you look at the Regard, number 14 is the Regard des Anges, Regard the Angels, and Messiaen explained that piece to me as a battle, a struggle between the angels and the birds for who should get the gift of music. And the angels, they're not at all like Christmas card angels. I mean, they're represented by very dissonant sort of rhythmic elements, and the birds above that. And they battle away, and then finally the angels fall silent, and there's a sort of cadenza for the birds. And then the final page of the piece, Messiaen explained to me, this is not in the score, he explained it to me, was with intervals widening all the time. And he said, this is the mouths of the angels gaping wide in astonishment that it's not to them but to the birds who are given the gift of music. Now this, he did a very nice imitation to that, but this is fantastically important. I mean, I should have mentioned this. Thank you so much. I should have mentioned this right at the beginning. Why are birds so important to Messiaen? Because he believed that they are the musicians in God's creation. Ergo, if you're going to write down birdsong, you've jolly well got to get it right. So accuracy had a religious motive for Messiaen. As you'll see, accuracy took all sorts of creative forms, but still that was the thing. And you have to say that Messiaen in the 1950s probably knew more about birdsong than anybody on the planet, for sure. You know, he went out, he filled 303 notebooks, you know, and there were probably plenty more that have, you know, got lost. So no, it was a fantastic thing. But thank you very much. Yes, you can see Messiaen's theology in number 14 of the Regard.
Number 14. Oh, right.
So I think we should probably draw it to a close now. But I think this has been a fantastic example of how the insight into how Messiaen found and then manipulated and worked with this material to produce something that is really music that we all know really well. But and actually seeing that process, you say maybe it's an insight we shouldn't have because it's a private one that we might not have wanted us to have. We had that discussion with postgraduate taught students today about, you know, should we be looking at materials that are private, and if we do it with care. But actually the insights into the sort of musical process